She arrived without diamonds, without pearls, without a single glittering stone on her body. And within the hour, she owned every room she walked through. The Cavendish Midsummer Ball was the kind of event that existed less for enjoyment and more for judgment. It was the unofficial opening of the London season's second act, the moment when the initial wave of engagements had been announced and the remaining unmarried women were quietly reassessed, revalued, and, in many cases, written off entirely. Invitations were currency, attendance was compulsory, and appearance, down to the last pearl button and sapphire earring, was the language through which a woman's worth was publicly declared. Every woman in that ballroom understood this. Every neckline carried a fortune. Every wrist was weighted with gold. Every earlobe sparkled with the silent, glittering argument that this daughter was valuable. This family was solvent. This girl was worth the investment. And then there was Iris Whitford. Iris arrived alone, which was the first offense. She stepped from a hired hackney, rather than a private carriage, which was the second. Her chaperone, a distant cousin named Mrs. Plimpton, had developed a violent headache at the last moment and sent Iris ahead with a hastily scribbled note of introduction and a prayer that the girl would have the sense not to do anything memorable. She was about to do something very memorable. The gown was the third offense, though calling it an offense was generous. It was a dress of deep midnight blue, cut simply, fitted closely through the bodice, and falling in clean, unadorned lines to the floor. The fabric was good, a fine woven cotton sateen with a subtle sheen that caught the candlelight like still water. But it was not silk, it was not satin, it was not embroidered, beaded, laced, ribboned, or enhanced in any way. It was, by the standards of the Cavendish Ballroom, practically naked. But the jewels were the real catastrophe. There were none. Iris Whitford walked into the most glittering room in London, wearing absolutely nothing on her throat, nothing on her wrists, nothing in her dark auburn hair, which was swept up in a simple arrangement held by two plain tortoiseshell combs. Her ears were bare. Her fingers were bare. The only ornamentation on her entire person was a thin black velvet ribbon tied at the base of her throat, a choker so plain it looked almost defiant. She stood in the entrance for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for the footman to announce her name, long enough for 40 heads to turn, long enough for the room to take one collective look and reach its verdict. The whispers began before she reached the bottom of the stairs. Good Lord, is she in mourning? Who is she? Whitford? I don't know any Whitfords. Country family. Hampshire, I think. No money. The father was a scholar of some sort. A scholar? How quaint. And the mother? Dead. Years ago. Well, that explains the dress. Is she actually wearing nothing? Not a single stone. Perhaps she pawned them for the Hackney Fair. Laughter. Light. Musical. Perfectly calibrated to carry, without being traced back to its source. The laughter of women who had been trained since childhood to wound without leaving visible marks. Iris heard every word. She descended the curved staircase with her back straight, her chin level, and her hands resting lightly at her sides. Her face betrayed nothing, not because she felt nothing, but because she had learned, through years of managing a crumbling household and a father who lived inside his books, while the world outside them fell to pieces, that the worst thing you could give people who wanted to see you bleed was the satisfaction of a wound. She reached the ballroom floor. The crowd parted, not in deference, but in the way pedestrians part around something slightly distasteful, maintaining distance, while pretending not to notice. Iris walked through the gap with the unhurried stride of a woman who had no one to impress and no one to meet, and was therefore free to move at precisely her own pace. She found a pillar. It was a good pillar, marble, tucked into a slight alcove near the edge of the dance floor, close enough to observe without being in the way. She positioned herself against it with the easy, practiced grace of a woman who had attended enough gatherings to know exactly where the invisible people stood. She watched. The ballroom was magnificent. She could admit that without resentment. The Cavendish family had been hosting this event for 40 years, and every surface showed it. The chandeliers were Venetian glass, enormous cascading structures that threw prismatic light across the cream and gold walls. The floor was inlaid parquet, polished to a mirror finish. Banks of white roses and trailing ivy framed every window, and the French doors stood open to a terrace where paper lanterns swayed in the warm evening breeze. And everywhere, jewels. The room was a treasury. Diamonds blazed at every throat. Rubies dripped from earlobes. Emeralds winked from corsages. Sapphire bracelets caught the candlelight and threw blue fire across the dance floor. The women moved through the room like constellations, each one a small, glittering galaxy orbiting the central question of the evening. Where was the Duke of Ashburn? Henry Calloway, the 7th Duke of Ashburn, was the reason half the room existed tonight, and the reason the other half was pretending not to care. He was 30 years old, holder of the largest private fortune in England, master of Greymoor Park, and, by the reluctant consensus of every gossip column in the city, the most difficult man in the British aristocracy. He was not difficult in the way that cruel men are difficult, all sharp edges and visible malice. He was difficult in the way that deep water is difficult, still on the surface, unfathomable beneath, and entirely capable of drowning anyone who misjudged the depth. He was known for 3 things: his intellect, which was formidable, his silence, which was legendary, and his complete, absolute, seemingly pathological refusal to be charmed. He had been courted by the finest women in Europe. Continental princesses had been suggested, heiresses had been offered, daughters of cabinet ministers, widows of earls, granddaughters of archbishops. He had been polite to all of them. He had been interested in none of them. He moved through society like a ghost, with a title, present in body, absent in every way that mattered, and the more he withdrew, the more desperately they pursued him. He was expected tonight. Lady Cavendish had confirmed it. The machinery of the evening had been calibrated around his attendance, the seating rearranged, the music selected, the 5 most promising candidates positioned along his anticipated route from the entrance to the refreshment room. He arrived 40 minutes late. He entered through a side door, rather than the main entrance, which meant there was no announcement, no fanfare, no carefully staged descent down the curved staircase. He simply appeared, tall, dark-haired, wearing evening clothes, so understated they bordered on austere, and positioned himself against the far wall with the expression of a man serving a sentence. Iris did not notice him at first. She was watching the dancers, studying the patterns the way her father would have studied a mathematical proof, tracing the geometry of the waltz, the precise angles of the turns, the invisible architecture that made 200 moving bodies look like a single organism. She found it beautiful in an abstract, mechanical way. The way one finds a clock beautiful. All those tiny parts, working in silent coordination. A voice beside her pierced the observation. No jewels. How brave. Iris turned. The woman standing next to her was perhaps 30, tall, sharp-featured, draped in emeralds that matched her cold green eyes. Her smile was the kind that required an education in cruelty to produce. Or how poor, the woman continued, her gaze traveling slowly down Iris's bare throat. I cannot decide which. Then you must find the ambiguity very distressing, Iris replied. Her voice was calm, conversational, entirely without heat. I understand. Certainty is a great comfort to those who require it. The woman's smile stiffened. She had expected embarrassment. She had expected a flush, a stammer, a retreat. She had not expected to be met at her own level by a girl in cotton with no ornaments. I am Lady Dorothea Sinclair, the woman said, as though the name itself were a jewel she was choosing to display. I know who you are, Iris said pleasantly. Your emeralds are quite famous, almost as famous as you. It was a compliment that was not quite a compliment. Lady Dorothea sensed the blade beneath the velvet, but could not locate it precisely enough to object. And you are? Iris Whitford. I do not know the name. No, you would not. Lady Dorothea examined her for a long, uncomfortable moment, the way a collector examines a specimen she cannot immediately classify. Then she gave a small, dismissive laugh and turned away, disappearing into the crowd with a swish of silk and emeralds. Iris returned her gaze to the dance floor. Her pulse was slightly elevated. Her hands were steady. She breathed. She did not know that the Duke of Ashburn had been watching. Henry had noticed her the moment she descended the staircase. Or rather, he had noticed the absence. In a room where every woman was a display case, the girl in midnight blue was a closed door, and closed doors, in Henry's experience, were the only ones worth opening. He had watched her walk through the crowd. He had seen the way she absorbed the whispers without deflecting them, taking the impact squarely, processing it, and continuing forward with the same unhurried stride. He had seen her find her pillar and settle against it with the particular ease of someone who was comfortable being alone. Not performatively so, not tragically so, but genuinely, constitutionally, at ease with her own company. He had watched her watch the room, and he had recognized something in the quality of her attention. She was not scanning for opportunities. She was not assessing threats. She was observing, with the patient, dispassionate curiosity of a naturalist watching a colony of insects, fascinated by the patterns, unmoved by the individual dramas. He had watched her exchange with Lady Dorothea. He had seen the precision of her response, the quiet refusal to be diminished, the blade disguised as courtesy. And he had felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Curiosity. Not the idle, surface curiosity of a bored man examining a novelty. Something deeper, something that had teeth. He crossed the ballroom. The crowd noticed. The crowd always noticed when the Duke of Ashburn moved, because he so rarely did. Conversations shifted. Gazes tracked. The 5 carefully positioned candidates adjusted their postures and their smiles. Henry walked past all of them. He walked past Lady Dorothea, who turned with the expectation of acknowledgement and received none. He walked past Lady Cavendish, who was mid-sentence with the Archbishop's wife and nearly dropped her champagne glass. He walked directly, unhesitatingly, with the focused stride of a man who had identified his destination and saw no reason to pretend otherwise, to the marble pillar where Iris Whitford stood alone. He stopped in front of her. Iris looked up at him. She did not know who he was. This was immediately, startlingly apparent. She looked at him the way one looks at any stranger who has approached uninvited, with polite, cautious attention and a slight, almost imperceptible tilt of her head that suggested she was waiting for him to explain himself. "You are standing against my pillar," Henry said. It was, by any measure, a ridiculous opening. He knew it, the moment the words left his mouth. He, who had been educated at Eton and Oxford, who had addressed the House of Lords, who was considered one of the finest conversationalists in the country when he chose to converse, had opened with a territorial claim on a piece of marble. Iris looked at the pillar. She looked back at him. "I was not aware that pillars were subject to ownership," she said. "This one is. I have been leaning against it at Cavendish balls for the past 8 years. I have a prior claim. 8 years is a long time to lean against a pillar. I am a patient man. You are a man who has just crossed an entire ballroom to argue about architecture. I suspect patience is not your defining quality. Henry felt the corners of his mouth move. It was not quite a smile. It was the muscular precursor to a smile. The involuntary twitch of a mechanism that had been dormant for so long he had almost forgotten the sensation. "You do not know who I am," he said. "No. You genuinely do not know." "I genuinely do not. Should I?" He studied her face. There was no coyness in the question, no false modesty designed to provoke a flattering revelation. She simply did not know. She was a woman from Hampshire who had arrived in a hackney and had no one in the room to whisper identities in her ear. "Henry Calloway," he said. "Mr. Calloway. The Duke of Ashburn." Iris blinked. It was the only visible reaction, a single, rapid blink, the kind that accompanies the sudden recalculation of a situation. Then her expression settled back into its previous composure. "I see," she said. "In that case, I imagine this pillar has been reserved for you since birth. Since my christening, at least. Then I shall relocate. I would not wish to displace a duke from his architectural territory." She pushed away from the pillar. She was about to step past him when he spoke. "Miss Whitford." She stopped. She had not told him her name. She saw the knowledge register on her face, the quick, sharp awareness that he had already known who she was before he crossed the room. "You knew my name," she said. It was not an accusation. It was an observation, delivered with the same quiet precision she brought to everything. "I asked." "Who did you ask?" "Lady Cavendish. When you descended the staircase." "When I descended the staircase, the entire room was laughing at me." "Not the entire room." The words settled between them. Iris looked at his face, at the dark eyes that gave away nothing, and yet had just given away everything. He had watched her come down the stairs. He had asked her name. He had crossed a ballroom to speak to her, while every jeweled woman in London waited for his attention. "Why?" she asked. It was the only question that mattered, and she asked it without embellishment. Henry looked at her. He looked at the bare throat, the black velvet ribbon, the midnight blue dress that held no light and needed none. He looked at her dark auburn hair, simply pinned, glowing copper in the candlelight. He looked at her face, angular and expressive, and entirely free of the careful, practiced blankness that every other woman in the room wore like an additional jewel. "Because every woman in this room is wearing a costume," he said, "and you are the only one who came as herself." Iris held his gaze. She did not blush. She did not look away. She held him the way she held everything, steadily, with the full weight of her attention. "That is either the most perceptive thing anyone has said to me," she replied, "or the most dangerous." "Why dangerous?" "Because if you see me clearly, I have nowhere to hide." The orchestra shifted. The current dance ended in a flourish of strings. The floor cleared briefly, couples drifting apart, new partners being negotiated in the subtle, coded language of fans and glances, and strategically positioned mothers. The opening notes of a waltz rose from the violins, slow, sweeping, inevitable. Henry extended his hand. His palm was open, his fingers steady. The gesture was simple, unadorned, as devoid of theater as the woman he was offering it to. "Dance with me," he said. The room heard him. The room heard him, because the room had been watching, because the Duke of Ashburn had crossed a ballroom and was now standing in front of an unknown woman with no jewels and was asking her to dance. and the collective intake of breath that followed was so sharp it was audible over the violins. Iris looked at his hand. She looked at the dance floor. She looked at the hundreds of watching faces, the emeralds and diamonds and sapphires, the fortress of wealth and breeding, and expectation that surrounded her on every side. "I should warn you," she said. "I am a very good dancer. I would expect nothing less from a woman who arrives at a ball without armor." She placed her hand in his. The contact was electric and immediate. The warmth of her bare skin against his gloved palm, an intimacy so small it should have been meaningless, and was instead the most significant thing that had happened in that room all evening. They walked to the dance floor. The crowd parted. It did not part gracefully or willingly. It parted the way water parts around a stone, with resistance, with turbulence, with a churning undercurrent of disbelief. Iris felt every eye. She felt the weight of every diamond in the room, pressing against her bare throat. She kept her gaze forward, her shoulders back, her hand steady in his. They reached the center of the floor. Henry turned to face her. He placed his hand at her waist. She placed her hand on his shoulder. They assumed the frame of the waltz with the quiet, mutual precision of two people who had each been waiting, in their separate silences, for exactly this. The music took them. Iris danced the way she existed, with clarity, with intention, with a grace that came not from training, but from an innate understanding of rhythm and space. She moved through the waltz as though the music had been written for her body, each step landing exactly where it needed to, each turn following the line of the melody with an instinct that could not be taught. Henry matched her. He was a technically accomplished dancer, trained in childhood, practiced through adolescence, and then abandoned, the way he had abandoned most things that required him to be present in his own body, rather than locked in the fortress of his mind. But dancing with Iris was different. She did not follow. She responded. She anticipated the pressure of his hand, the shift of his weight, the direction of his intention, and she met it, not with obedience but with partnership, two bodies moving as a single thought. They turned. The room blurred. The chandeliers streaked into ribbons of light above them. The faces at the edges of the floor dissolved into a watercolor of silk and judgment and open-mouthed astonishment. "They are staring," Iris said. "They have been staring at you since you arrived. The difference is that now they are confused. Because you chose me. Because you did not need to be chosen. That is what confuses them." Iris looked up at him. In the warm, golden light of 400 candles, her eyes were the color of dark honey, rich and clear and entirely unguarded. He saw in them no calculation, no strategy, no awareness of the social earthquake they were causing. She was simply dancing. She was simply here, in this music, in this moment, with this man, and the simplicity of it was more beautiful than every jewel in the room. "You are a strange man, Your Grace," she said. "Henry, Henry, you are a strange man, Henry. Because I asked you to dance. Because you seem to mean it." The waltz carried them through its final phrases. The violins climbed, sustained, and then released. The last note hanging in the candlelit air like a held breath. They slowed. They stopped. They stood in the center of the floor, still holding each other, while the room around them erupted into the restrained chaos of applause and whispered scandal. Henry did not release her hand. He looked down at her with an expression that had, over the course of a single waltz, undergone a fundamental alteration. The careful blankness was gone. In its place was something open, something searching, something that looked almost like wonder. "Will you take some air?" he asked. "The terrace is cooler. I would like that." They walked together off the dance floor, past the row of astonished mothers, past Lady Dorothea, whose emeralds suddenly looked less like armor and more like compensation, past Lady Cavendish, who was gripping her husband's arm with the intensity of a woman witnessing history and unsure whether to celebrate or intervene. The terrace was wide, stone-flagged, bordered by a low balustrade draped in climbing roses. Paper lanterns cast a warm, uneven glow across the space. Below, the gardens sloped gently downward into darkness, and beyond them, the city shimmered, a distant constellation of gas lamps and chimney smoke. They stood at the balustrade, side by side, not touching, breathing the cool night air. "Why no jewels?" Henry asked. It was the question everyone in the room wanted to ask. The difference was in how he asked it, not with mockery, not with pity, but with genuine curiosity, the way he might ask why a painting had been framed in a particular way. Iris looked out at the gardens. The breeze caught the loose strands of hair at her temples. "Because I do not own any," she said. The honesty was disarming. There was no shame in it, no apology, no elaborate excuse about leaving them at home or having them cleaned. She stated a fact, plainly, the way she might state the time. "My father was a scholar of classical languages," she continued. "He was brilliant, and he was impractical, and he spent every penny we had on books. When he died last year, I inherited a library that would make the British Museum envious and exactly £14 in the bank." Henry was quiet. He listened with the same focused attention he gave to everything that mattered. The invitation to this ball arrived 3 weeks ago. I do not know how. I suspect Mrs. Plimpton's connection to the Cavendish family is more tenuous than she implies. I came because my father taught me that the only thing more damaging than poverty is the fear of being seen in it. She turned to face him. Her dark honey eyes were steady. "I have no jewels, Henry. I have no fortune, no connections, no mother to arrange my hair, and no father to negotiate my dowry. I have a rented room in Cheapside, a collection of Aristotle in the original Greek, and a very thorough education in the art of surviving without pretending to be something I am not." She paused. "If that is not sufficient for your ballroom, I understand entirely." Henry looked at her. The lantern light played across her face, illuminating the fine, strong lines of her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes, the quiet, unshakable dignity that no amount of diamond could have improved upon. "When I was 12, he said, "my mother brought me to this ball. She wore a necklace that had been in the Calloway family for 6 generations. It was the Ashburn sapphire, a stone so large and so famous that it had its own name and its own entry in Burke's peerage." Iris listened. She wore it every year. She said it was the price of admission, not the literal price, but the cost. She said that in this world, a woman's worth was measured by what she wore around her neck, and that she hated it, but she understood the rules, and understanding the rules was the only way to survive them. He paused. His jaw worked. "She died when I was 16. The sapphire went into a vault. I have never opened it." "Why?" "Because she was right. It was the price of admission, and after she died, I stopped wanting to be admitted." The silence that followed was rich and full. The kind of silence that exists between two people who have each shown the other something they do not normally show. A vulnerability exchanged in equal measure, balanced and fair. "We are both hiding," Iris said softly. "You behind your silence. Me behind my refusal to pretend. Is it hiding if you know you are doing it? It is hiding if it keeps you from being known." Henry turned to face her fully. The lantern swayed in the breeze, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the stone. "Then let me know you," he said. Iris looked at him for a long time. The sounds of the ballroom drifted through the open doors behind them, muffled and distant, belonging to another world. "That is not a small thing you are asking," she said. "I know. Knowing me means knowing the rented room in Cheapside, and the 14 pounds, and the Aristotle. It means knowing that I cannot host your dinners, or charm your friends, or wear the Ashburn sapphire as though it were a natural extension of my body. It means knowing that I will never be what this world expects of a duchess. This world expected me to marry a woman who would wear the right necklace, and say the right things, and fill my house with the correct number of children. I have spent 14 years refusing, not because I am proud, but because I could not bear the thought of living beside someone who was performing a role instead of living a life." He stepped closer, not close enough to touch. Close enough to be certain she could see his face in the uneven light, could read every line and shadow, and the absolute, undisguised sincerity in his dark eyes. "You walked into that ballroom with nothing on your throat, and nothing to hide behind, and you were the only real person in a room full of costumes. That is not insufficient, Iris. That is extraordinary." Her breath caught. It was the smallest sound, barely a tremor in the warm night air, but he heard it, and something in his chest responded, a recognition so deep it felt like memory. "You are going to make me cry," she said. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were not. "I would not presume. It is not a presumption. It is a warning. Then I will look at the garden until you are ready." He turned his gaze toward the darkness. Iris pressed her fingers against her eyes. She breathed in, held it, released. When she lowered her hand, her composure was restored. Though the edges were softer, the armor thinned. "You are a very unusual duke," she said. "And you are a very unusual woman, without jewels. I prefer it that way." "So do I." From inside the ballroom, the orchestra struck up another waltz. The music floated through the open doors, carried on the warm breeze, mingling with the scent of roses and lantern smoke. Henry turned back to her. He did not extend his hand this time. He simply stood, facing her, his expression quiet and open, and entirely, devastatingly honest. "Would you like to dance?" he asked. "Out here, where no one is watching." Iris looked at him. She looked at the empty terrace, the stone floor, the lanterns swaying overhead. She looked at the darkness of the gardens, and the distant shimmer of the city, and the open sky above it all, clear and full of stars. "Yes," she said. They danced on the terrace. No audience, no chandeliers, no mirrors doubling the performance. Just the two of them, moving slowly through the warm June night, the music drifting from the ballroom, like a memory of something beautiful that no longer required witnesses. Henry held her carefully, his hand at her waist, her hand on his shoulder, the distance between their bodies, just enough to feel the warmth without the contact. They turned beneath the lanterns, and the light played across Iris's bare throat, and in its absence, in the clean, unadorned line of her neck and collarbone, Henry saw something that no sapphire, no matter how famous, could ever have produced. He saw her. "I would like to call on you," he said. "In Cheapside? If that is where you are. It is not a fashionable address. I am not a fashionable man. Your carriage alone would cause a riot. Then I will walk." Iris looked up at him. The waltz had slowed. They were barely moving, swaying more than dancing. Two people suspended in the space between a beginning and whatever came next. "You are serious," she said. "I have never been more serious about anything in my life, and I say that as a man who takes most things far too seriously. If you call on me, People will talk. People are already talking. They have been talking since I asked you to dance. By tomorrow morning, every drawing room in London will know that the Duke of Ashburn waltzed with a woman who wore no jewels, and half of them will be convinced I have gone mad. Have you? Possibly. But if madness feels like this, I have spent my entire sane life wasting time. Iris stopped moving. She stood still on the stone terrace, her hand still resting on his shoulder, her dark honey eyes searching his face with an intensity that made him feel, for the first time in his adult life, completely visible. Tuesday, she said. Tuesday? Call on me Tuesday. The room is small, and the tea is cheap, and the Aristotle takes up most of the good chair. But you are welcome. Henry looked at her. The stars were bright above them. The music was fading. The night was turning, the way all nights turn, toward an ending that was also, unmistakably, a beginning. Tuesday, he said. Iris released his shoulder. She stepped back. She smoothed the front of her midnight blue dress. The dress with no embellishment, no ornament, no compromise. She gave him a look that was neither a smile nor a farewell, but something in between. A quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted and could not be unshifted. And then she turned and walked toward the garden steps that led around the side of the house, away from the ballroom, away from the staring crowd, toward the hired hackney that was waiting to carry her back to her real life. Henry watched her go. Her dark silhouette moved through the lantern light and disappeared into the shadows of the garden path. He stood alone on the terrace, the stone warm beneath his feet, the roses climbing the balustrade, the city glittering in the distance. He went inside. He found Lady Cavendish. The woman who arrived without jewels, he said. Miss Iris Whitford. I want to know everything. Lady Cavendish looked at him the way one looks at a perfectly sensible building that has suddenly decided to grow wings. Everything, Your Grace? Everything. He called on her Tuesday. The room in Cheapside was exactly as she had described. Small, clean, ruthlessly organized. A single window overlooked a narrow street. A writing desk occupied one corner. A bookshelf, constructed from planks and bricks, covered an entire wall, overflowing with volumes in Greek, Latin, French, and English. The good chair was indeed occupied by a complete works of Aristotle in the original Attic Greek, and Iris had to relocate it to a stack on the floor to make room for him. She served tea. It was cheap, as promised. But she brewed it with the same attention she brought to everything. The water at the correct temperature, the leaves steeped for the correct duration, poured into cups that were mismatched but immaculately clean. Henry sat in the cleared chair and looked around the room. He saw the careful economy of a life lived, unlimited means, and unlimited intelligence. He saw the annotated margins of the books, the careful notes in her handwriting, the evidence of a mind that consumed knowledge the way other people consumed air. Your father's library, he said, looking at the shelves. What I could save of it. The collection was sold to pay his debts. But I kept the volumes he loved most, the ones with his notes in the margins. Henry stood up. He walked to the bookshelf. He tilted his head to read the spines. His fingers stopped on a volume. He read Thucydides in the original. He taught me to read it by the time I was 11. I struggled with Thucydides at Oxford. My tutor said I lacked the patience for Attic syntax. Your tutor was probably right. Thucydides requires patience. He also requires the willingness to sit with a sentence for an hour and not understand it and keep sitting, quite. Henry looked at her. She was standing by the small window, holding her teacup in both hands, the afternoon light catching the auburn in her hair. She looked at home. She looked entirely, uncompromisingly herself. The same woman she had been in the ballroom, stripped of context, and still exactly the same. "You are remarkable," he said. "I am a woman with a bookshelf and a teapot." Remarkable is a strong word. It is the correct word. You say that because you are sitting in my chair in my room, and the novelty of a duke in Cheapside has temporarily impaired your judgment. My judgment is functioning quite well. It is the rest of my faculties that are in question. Iris smiled. It was the first real smile he had seen from her. Not the controlled, composed expression she wore in public, but a genuine, unguarded warmth that transformed her angular face into something luminous. "Drink your tea," she said. "It is getting cold." He drank his tea. It was cheap and slightly bitter and absolutely perfect. He came back on Thursday. He came back on Saturday. He came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that, and every Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday, for the remainder of June and the whole of July. They talked. They talked about Thucydides and Aristotle and the decline of the Roman Republic. They talked about estate management and agricultural reform and the shocking inefficiency of the British postal system. They argued about Plato's Republic, which Iris found naive and Henry found aspirational. A disagreement that lasted 3 visits and ended in a draw that satisfied neither of them and delighted both. They talked about smaller things too. The sound of rain on the Cheapside window, the particular quality of light in the late afternoon, the way a good sentence, read aloud, could change the temperature of a room. Henry brought her books, rare volumes he found in the antiquarian shops he had never before had reason to visit. Iris accepted them with the grave, critical attention of a scholar evaluating a gift's intellectual merit. "This edition of Herodotus has a printing error in Book 7, she told him, turning the volume over in her hands. "Is it still acceptable?" "It is acceptable. The error is charming. Your taste is improving." He laughed. It startled him. He could not remember the last time he had laughed in someone's company, without the sound feeling like a performance. London noticed. London always noticed. The gossip columns, which had initially treated the Cavendish ball as a momentary aberration, began to take a more sustained interest. The Duke of Ashburn had been seen entering a building in Cheapside. The Duke of Ashburn had been seen carrying books. The Duke of Ashburn had been seen smiling, which was itself considered newsworthy. Lady Dorothea Sinclair held a luncheon at which she described Iris Whitford as a clever little creature who has worked out that the fastest way to a duke's attention is to pretend you do not want it. The remark circulated through Mayfair within hours. It reached Iris by evening. She said nothing about it when Henry arrived on Thursday. She served tea. She discussed the Peloponnesian War. She argued, with her usual precision, that Pericles' funeral oration was the finest piece of political rhetoric in Western history, and that anyone who disagreed was historically illiterate. Henry watched her. He saw the slight tension in her shoulders. He saw the way her gaze drifted to the window and came back. He saw the almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw when she mentioned, in passing, that she had been to the market that morning and the fishmonger's wife had asked if she was that girl the Duke is keeping. "Iris," he said. She stopped mid-sentence. She looked at him. "I heard what Lady Sinclair said. It does not matter. It matters. It is what people say. People have been saying things about me since I walked into that ballroom without diamonds. I have survived worse commentary than the opinion of a woman whose primary accomplishment is the strategic deployment of emeralds. You are angry. I am not angry. I am tired. There is a difference." She set down her teacup. She walked to the window and stood with her back to him, looking out at the narrow street below. "This is what I warned you about," she said quietly. "This is the world you live in. A woman without jewels is either pitiable or predatory. And there is no third option. If I am poor, I am a charity case. If I have your attention, I am a schemer. There is no version of this story in which I am simply a person. Henry stood up. He crossed the small room and stood behind her, close enough to see the tension in the line of her neck, the rigid set of her shoulders, the effort it cost her to hold herself together against the steady, relentless abrasion of a world that had decided her worth before she ever opened her mouth. "There is one version," he said. "What version?" "The true one. The true one is not popular. The true one is the only one that interests me." Iris turned to face him. They were very close. The afternoon light fell between them, catching the dust motes in the air, turning them to gold. "What is the true one, Henry?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. Beneath the composure, beneath the armor of honesty and intellect, he saw the thing she had been carrying since the night of the ball, the night she had walked into a room full of diamonds and had nothing but herself to offer. Fear, not of the gossip, not of the cruelty, fear that the thing she was, stripped of pretense, laid bare, undecorated, would be examined in the full light of day and found wanting. Henry raised his hand. He placed it against her cheek. His thumb rested on the line of her jaw. Her skin was warm. "The true version," he said, "is that I have spent 14 years looking for a reason to stop standing against walls, and you are the reason. Not because you are clever, though you are the cleverest person I have ever met. Not because you are brave, though walking into the Cavendish ball without jewels required more courage than most men summon in a lifetime. Because you are honest, because you see the world as it actually is, and you refuse to decorate it, and in a life spent surrounded by decoration, that is the most extraordinary thing I have ever encountered." Iris's eyes filled. She let them. She did not press her fingers against her face, or turn away, or perform the careful, practiced management of emotion that the world expected of her. She stood in the cheap afternoon light of her rented room in Cheapside, and let the tears fall down her face, while the Duke of Ashburn held her jaw in his hand, and looked at her as though she were the only real thing in a world made of glass. "I have nothing to give you," she whispered. "No dowry, no connections, no sapphires. I do not want sapphires. I have a vault full of sapphires. I want Tuesday afternoons, and arguments about Pericles, and cheap tea that you brew, as though the correct water temperature is a moral obligation." She laughed. It was wet, broken, and entirely beautiful. "It is a moral obligation," she said. Henry leaned forward. He pressed his forehead against hers. They stood like that, foreheads touching, breathing the same air, in the small room with the books, and the mismatched cups, and the afternoon light turning everything gold. "Marry me," he said. "You cannot marry me." "I can. I am a duke. The only person whose permission I require is yours. Society will never accept it. Society accepted a king who could not read, and a prime minister who gambled away the national treasury. Society's standards of acceptability are, at best, inconsistent." Iris pulled back. She looked at his face, searching it, reading it, the way she read everything, with her full attention and her unsparing honesty. "If I marry you," she said, "I will not wear the sapphire. I did not ask you to. I will not pretend to be someone I am not. I will not learn to simper, or flatter, or manage your social calendar with the vacant smile of a professional hostess. I would be horrified if you did. I will bring my books. I will build you a library. I will argue with you. I am counting on it. I will serve cheap tea to your guests, and they will be appalled. They will survive. Iris looked at him for a long time. The tears had dried on her cheeks. Her dark honey eyes were clear, luminous, stripped of every defense. "Yes," she said. Henry kissed her. It was gentle, careful, and tasted of cheap tea and salt. She kissed him back with the same precision she brought to everything, knowing exactly what she was doing and choosing to do it anyway. They were married in September, in the village church near Graymore Park, on a gray morning that smelled of rain and turning leaves. Iris wore a dress of deep blue wool, simple, unadorned, with the black velvet ribbon at her throat. She carried no bouquet. She wore no jewels. Henry wore the same austere black he always wore. He stood at the altar and watched her walk toward him, and the expression on his face, witnessed only by the vicar, the estate steward, and Mrs. Plimpton, who had recovered from her headache and was weeping into a handkerchief, was not the expression of a man acquiring a wife. It was the expression of a man who had finally, after 14 years, found a reason to leave the wall. Graymore Park received its new duchess, the way all great houses receive change, with suspicion, curiosity, and the slow, grudging recognition that the change was necessary. Iris did not redecorate. She did not host balls. She did not fill the house with flowers, or music, or the expensive, performative warmth that society expected of a duke's wife. She opened the library, which had been locked since Henry's mother died, and she filled it. She brought her father's books first, the annotated Aristotle and the Herodotus, with the printing error. Then she began acquiring, systematically, intelligently, with the focused passion of a woman who had spent her entire life hungry for knowledge, and finally had the resources to feed. She catalogued. She organized. She wrote to scholars across Europe. She established a correspondence with a professor of classics at Edinburgh who was initially skeptical about corresponding with a duchess, and was eventually so impressed by her command of Attic Greek that he dedicated a paper to her. Henry watched her transform his house into a living, breathing institution of the mind, and he felt, with each passing week, the walls he had built around himself becoming not just unnecessary, but impossible to maintain. She was in every room. Her books were on every table. Her voice carried through the corridors, sometimes arguing with the housekeeper about the organization of the linen closet, sometimes reading aloud from Thucydides to no one in particular, sometimes laughing at something only she understood. He loved her. He loved her the way a man loves air, after nearly drowning, with desperate, grateful, slightly astonished devotion. Autumn deepened. The leaves fell. The rains came, heavy and persistent, turning the grounds to mud and the sky to a low, gray ceiling that pressed against the windows. Iris worked in the library. Henry worked beside her, ostensibly reading parliamentary reports, actually watching her annotate a 12th century manuscript, with the absorbed concentration of a woman who had forgotten that anything else existed. "You are staring," she said, not looking up. "I am observing." Observing is just staring, with intellectual pretensions. Then I am staring, with intellectual pretensions. She looked up. She smiled. It was the smile he had first seen in Cheapside, warm and real, and entirely for him. "Come here," she said. He went. He sat on the arm of her chair, which was too small for both of them, and perfect for exactly that reason. She leaned into him. He put his arm around her shoulders. They sat together in the library, surrounded by books, the rain tapping against the tall windows, the fire crackling in the grate. Two people who had found each other in a room full of glitter, and chosen instead the quiet, unadorned truth of each other's company. On the mantelpiece, in a glass case that Henry had commissioned from the finest craftsman in London, sat the Ashburn sapphire. It was enormous, a deep, violent blue, set in a collar of diamonds that threw fractured light across the room when the fire caught it. Iris had found it in the vault. She had not put it on. She had held it in her hands, felt the weight of 6 generations, the price of admission that Henry's mother had paid every season, and she had placed it in the glass case on the mantelpiece, where the light could reach it. It should be seen, she told Henry. Not worn, seen. The way beautiful things should be. Free of the neck it was chained to. Henry looked at the sapphire, blazing in its case. He looked at his wife, curled in her chair, wearing a dress of plain gray wool and a thin black velvet ribbon at her throat. She was the most beautiful thing in the room, and she would have been the most beautiful thing in any room. And the sapphire, for all its fire, could not compete with the simple, extraordinary fact of a woman who needed no decoration to be seen. Winter came. The first snow fell on Greymoor, covering the grounds in white, softening every edge, turning the world into something clean and new. Iris stood at the library window, a cup of tea in her hands, watching the flakes drift past the glass. Henry came up behind her. He wrapped his arms around her waist and rested his chin on the top of her head. She leaned back into him, solid and warm. Lady Sinclair has written to accept our invitation to the Christmas gathering, Iris said. Has she? She has. She described herself as deeply curious to see what the Duke's unconventional bride has done with the place. She underlined unconventional. And what will the Duke's unconventional bride do with this information? Iris took a sip of her tea. Serve her the cheap tea. From the mismatched cups. Henry laughed. The sound filled the library, warm and real. The laugh of a man who had spent 14 years in silence and had found, in a woman without jewels, every sound he had been missing. They stood together at the window, watching the snow cover their world, and the house around them was quiet, not with the suffocating silence of an empty life, but with the deep, contented hush of a home that was finally, irreversibly, lived in. The sapphire blazed on the mantelpiece. The books lined every wall. The tea was cheap and perfectly brewed, and the Duchess of Ashburn wore a black velvet ribbon at her throat, and nothing else. And she was, by any measure that mattered, the richest woman in England. Thank you for listening to this story. If the quiet dignity of Iris and the transformation of the Duke of Ashburn moved you, please give this video a like and share it with anyone who loves a slow-burn historical romance built on honesty rather than spectacle. Subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Tell me in the comments, what was the moment that stayed with you? The bare throat in the ballroom, the terrace waltz, or the cheap tea in Cheapside? I would love to hear from you. Until next time.